Hello, this is the lecture for Topic 10, Chapter 5 on Education Policy. So, what are we going to be learning about in this lecture? Well, first, we're just going to ask some broad questions about education and education policy. Then, we're going to move in and we're going to take a look at the three phases of education policy. We're going to focus on the phase one of education policy, which is separate spheres. So, let's go ahead and get started. So let's take a look at some broad questions as it relates to education. So the first question is just what is the purpose of education? Why do we educate people? Is the purpose of education to learn skills? So you want to learn skills in order to improve the economy. You learn skills to improve yourself and your family. Is the purpose of education to learn certain values, to basically politically socialize people to embrace the core values of that political culture? Is the purpose of education to socialize people to certain behaviors, following rules, obeying authority, learning certain gender roles? Um, is the purpose of education to better oneself or to better the nation that you live in? Probably the answer is a little bit of yes to all of those questions. Another question is do you have a right to an education? Is when you live in a democracy, you need educated citizenry so that they can vote in a way that is reasoned and informed. And so, is that a right that national government should fulfill and be supportive of? And if you do have a right to an education, how far does that right go? Is it just you have a right to an education for the first 6 years, the first 12 years? Or does that right extend to that you have a right to have the first 4 years of a post high school, college degree, or even beyond? And then who should pay for education? If we think that it's a public right to have education, then the public should pay for it. Is it better if it's privately funded? That we see a move in the United States to sort of embrace choice schools, privately owned schools that compete with publicly owned schools in order to create a marketplace between schools to, have competition and improvement within schools. And so, who should pay for education and how much should they pay? The reason we start here is because how we answer these questions really shapes education policy. If you think the purpose of education is to learn skills, then you are going to, maybe the next question is what kind of skills? And then you focus your education policy on that. If it's to transmit values or political values, you might have more civic education, etc. So, however, we answer these questions really drives the sorts of public policies we have around education. So, since this is a class on women in public policy or gender in public policy, how we answer these questions can have an implication for women and whether or not they are to be educated. Education policy, if we say that education is a right, or we say that education should have a particular curriculum, if we say that education is a right and therefore it should be publicly funded, and that's generally the approach that the United States has taken, that education is sort of a right. It's compulsory that you go to school through most of high school in the United States, and the public pays for that. It's that there's no tuition that you have to pay. But because of that model, that education is always about divvying up scarce resources, that education is seen as a public investment with a public payoff. And if the public is paying taxpayer dollars, they want to make sure that they're getting what they're paying for. And, it can also be that, like, when we think about whether we should extend public investment into higher education, the question would be, well, is that something, is there a reason for doing that? Like, what is the economic benefits of providing free tuition for the first 4 years of a college degree, right? Like, what does the public get in exchange for that? And so education policy is always about scarce resources and how those scarce resources are being spent. And because it's about scarce resources, that sometimes when we ask up the question about education policy, a question that comes up is, okay, well, who should get educated. Are all groups worthy of education? Now, obviously, today, as a result of Title IX and the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that bars racial discrimination in education. Title IX obviously bars gender discrimination in education. And the answer to that question is that at least through high school, that everybody is worthy of being educated. Although we see discrepancies within urban schools in terms of the type of education that you get compared to schools that are in the way we fund schools through property taxes. And so even there, even though everybody's seen as worthy of being educated, not only the education that we receive, depending on where we live, is not comparable. And so, that some groups are, when we're answering this question, are seen as being worthy of expenditures. And that is a reflection of the social power. And so when it comes to gender, which gender has power? When it comes to race, which race has power? When it comes to class or nationality, which of those groups have the most power? Immigrants or non-immigrants when it comes to nationality. So if you were to more broadly study education policy, you would see that those groups that have power are usually the ones who dictate education policy. And as other groups rise in power, we have a changing understanding of equity in education policy can follow suit. Now, historically, women initially were thought to be not worthy of the expenditure. That when it came to you need to teach women a skill in order to improve our economy, you'd say, well, women don't participate in the economy, so why would they need that skill? So early in compulsory education, early in the United States, primarily benefited a certain group of people, generally white young boys. But as the perspective on education changes, so does policy change. And so let's take a look at how those changes in public policy as it relates to gender and education came about. Your textbook points out the three phases in women's education that are proposed by Florence Howe, who is the founding editor of Feminist Press. And she talks about how the first phase of education, the answer to the question of whether or not women should be educated, the answer was yes, but they should be educated in a sphere that is separate from boys. The second phase is of education policy in the United States is equal capacity. And so that is obviously a move that starts with the liberation movements in the 1960s and you know, brings about the Title IX policy. And so that men and women, boys and girls, have the equal capacity to thrive or not thrive in education. And then the final phase that Howe identifies is the education developing new knowledge through feminist lens, and that generally applies to higher education and the development and proliferation of women's studies programs and today gender studies programs. In our lecture, we're going to focus primarily on phase one. So phase one, separate spheres, as we'll see in a moment, starts about the early part of the 19th century. And it emphasizes two things. It emphasizes that education for women is most needed in order to transmit values. And we'll be learning about this thing called Republican motherhood in a moment. And that also that women should be educated in order to provide needed skills, but not skills as it relates to the economy, but skills as it relates to becoming a proper woman and then in the future a proper mother. Now, prior to the 19th century, most girls and boys were educated at home. There was not widespread compulsory education in the 18th century, that most of that education was, particularly for those who were privileged and wealthy, was done at home through tutors. And for those who were not privileged and not wealthy and not white, that education was not available. But starting in the early part of the 19th century, we see that there are increased opportunities for primary education for girls, and in particular for white girls. And let's look at why. Why do we see this increase in the support for policy to extend primary education to include young girls? The thinking for separate spheres was the purpose of education is to transmit values and skills, but certain kinds of values and certain kinds of skills. And it plays into this idea of Republican motherhood, and that being that we live in a democracy and that people need to learn democratic values in order to teach their future children, in particular their future boy children, but girl children as well, these values. And how do you learn these democratic values? You go to school. And so it was important that white young girls would go to get primary education in order to learn these democratic values, such as that uh, decisions are made by the majority, that all people are created equal, that there are certain liberties, a sense of individual responsibility, etc. Because we're a new nation, right? I mean, and so the 19th century new nation starting to develop, starting to be concerned about like our sense of thriving and lasting. And so that there was a sense that we really need to make sure that these democratic values were instilled in people. I just want you to take note of that word Republican motherhood. This is before the advent of the Republican Party. So when you see the word Republican, it's not like how we think about the word Republican today. Republican there means the republic. And a republic is the kind of democracy that we have in the United States. A republic is representative democracy. The people have the power, but the way they exercise that power is through electing representatives. And so this notion of republicanism, supporting the republic, and women and future mothers being behind that was essential to the expansion of education. Another aspect of the separate spheres education and why women, young girls, were beginning to be educated in primary and welcomed into primary education had to do with not just learning values, but learning skills. And so it was this idea of the cult of womanhood at the beginning part of the 19th century. You know, this idea that there were very separate skills, right? That men outside of the home, so young boys were being trained to work outside of the home and have a skill set and provide for their family, whereas girls also needed to have these skills. And that the skills that they needed were how to become a nurturer, how to be able to, educate your children as they're younger in their letters and in their numbers before they enter into primary education, and also homemaking skills, how to cook, how to make clothes, etc. And so that was these separate spheres that developed, that allowed young girls to learn these skills. Now I don't know if you have this anymore, but I grew up in a time that was still a reflection of those separate spheres, sort of. That actually it was sort of a fraying of the separate spheres. And so we in my middle school we had you had home economics, but you also had shop. And when my sister went to school, those were separate because she's older than I am. Girls would take home ec, boys would take shop. But when I went to school, because I'm younger than my sister, then it was like, nope, both boys and girls take home ec and both boys and girls take shop. But it was kind of funny. The home ec teacher always treated the boys as if they were sort of dum-dums in home economics and vice versa in shop. But still, at least it was gender equity as at that time. And so public education is really seen as this cornerstone of this education for young girls and young women, because again, it should be a public investment in because we are creating people that are going to be instilled with these public values and these important skills necessary for propping up the American family. By the 19th century, the mid part of the 19th century, we're seeing that girls and women are getting more access to public secondary and higher education. And your textbook points out three reasons for why that is. One is that there's an increased demand for public primary school teachers. And so, as we see increased access for both boys and girls to primary education, you need to have teachers. And to become a teacher, you need to have like a higher level of education than your students, right? Whether that is a high school education or higher education, the so called normal schools that were dedicated to teaching women how to become teachers. And so, because there was an increased demand for primary school, that opened the door for women to enter into secondary and higher education. And women were seen as best suited for primary school teachers. For one, there was this sense that primary school is sort of younger children, and so you're a teacher, but you're also sort of a nurturer as well. And going with traditional gender norms, women were seen as more nurturing in nature. But women were also cheaper, and so that if you were hiring a single man to be a primary teacher, you would have to pay them more because that single man was preparing to earn money in order to get married, right? And if that man was married, well, again, there would be a higher salary because of the sort of responsibilities that individual would have. And so women, are cheaper because if they're single, they're still probably living with their family, and probably not a lot of married women were teaching. But if they were, it would still be seen as a supplemental income. So that's one reason why we see women entering into secondary and higher education at this time period. The second reason that your textbook gives about why we have more women entering secondary and higher education is due to the Civil War and the changing demographics um, due to the loss of life in the Civil War. That a lot of men lost their lives in the Civil War, and that there were in our population there were more women than there were men, and there weren't enough husbands. And so the thinking was that usually women leave their father and go to their husband, and that they have a provider, first father and then husband. Well, if there aren't as many husbands, there aren't as many providers, and so secondary and higher ed is a way for women to be able to get the skills that they need in order to take care of themselves, since there may not be enough husbands. Now that you need to train women for skill sets, but suitable vocations. So vocations like bookkeeping, nursing, commercial, clerical skills, those sorts of things. And so that there was sort of limited access in terms of the kinds of higher professional education, professional schools, teaching, yes, but also the so-called ladies' profession of nursing, bookkeeping, etc. And then finally, that there is, as we grow as a nation, and after the Civil War, we see an increased economic growth in the United States. That's in part because of westward expansion. And so that as we move west, there's a need for people to move west as well to provide education for the people and other skills for the people that are moving west. There's the Morrill Land Grant Act of 1862 that allows the creation of land grant colleges in the United States, that using the proceeds of federal land sales. And so you have a growth of institutions of higher ed, so that there are also schools of education and nursing that are developed at that time, again, sort of suitable for women's higher education needs. And so there were more opportunities for everybody, and those opportunities impacted women as well. So, as more women are having access to secondary and higher education, uh, that brings about some debate and also some conflict in the United States. And through these sort of reactions to that expansion of women into education that begins paving the way for phase two of the education policy, equal capacity. So on the one side, you see first wave feminists, and that they are, of course, excited about the expanding opportunities that women have when it comes to education. So, that, again, it kind of goes back to this idea. Remember that getting the vote is sort of the first step to greater political equality. And that, kind of access to education is that first step to greater social equality and political equality as well. And so first wave feminists were sort of like, first you get the vote, then can run for office. You're seen as a political player. They sort of saw education as the same way. You get access to primary, then secondary, then higher, and then because you're demonstrating as a woman your skills in education, that it is challenges some of the norms we have about like what women are capable of. And so for them, it was the first step towards social equality. And those are coupled with the first wave feminist and the support and wanting to enhance women's access to education were uh, coupled with the formation of two interest groups that are still relevant today. And so in 1881, the American Association of University Women was formed. That was basically an interest group that was promoting women's interest in higher ed. And the National Association of College Women in 1896, which focused on African American women having access to higher ed. And so you can sort of see that as sort of first wave feminists use this as an opportunity to make themselves more powerful on the political stage. With increased access comes backlash. And that backlash revolves around the fears associated with the having women teachers and also the fear associated with women entering into higher education. And so there was some fear mongering that was going on because of the fear regarding sort of the impact of having lots of women teachers, the impact that that might have on the gender norms and traditions. And so there was a concern that, and this was a concern that was brought up in 1914 his name was Admiral Chadwick, and he was a top Navy admiral, and he was concerned about the feminizing aspects of coeducation and also the concerns of women teachers. That they felt that female teachers are feminized boys, and so that they're not acting as the best role models for boys, and that also coeducation, allowing boys and girls to study together, sort of destroys the gender order. That as young girls and young women can demonstrate they're just as good, or that as we see that boys are maybe encouraged to try skill sets that are seen as like not necessarily boy skill sets or whatever. There's concern about this destroying the gendered order. And when it came to higher education, there was actually Harvard Medical School in 1873, supposedly did a study. It doesn't sound like it was very well researched, but it said that when women, are in higher education, just the stress and the workload, that it can harm their lady parts. In other words, that it can have a negative impact on the women's reproductive capacities. Okay. And so, there were responses to these concerns that were being leveled by those who had a backlash to the expanding educational access for women. One was, and I'm not joking, that there was, in order to make sure that boys weren't being feminized, what do we need? We need large-scale sports programs. And so that the creation of large-scale athletic programs in public schools, football, basketball, baseball, is really sort of seen as a way that boy students can like brush off the feminization that might come from having a lady teacher. And that the persistent barriers to higher education for women, that those continue as well as a response to the claims that, hey, this might be bad for women and their reproductive capacity. As we move out of the 19th century and into the 20th century, we see the movement towards equality and the towards phase two, which is the equal capacity. We're not going to be spending a lot of time talking about this. I'm going to have you watch a little video that has to do with Title IX, and the professor does a much better job at talking about Title IX than I do. But the emphasis on the second capacity was changing policy to reflect the changing understanding of equality and equal capacity of girls and women, and have our educational policy follow suit. So just as a refresher, remember that Title IX, and that's the educational policy that really shapes the second phase of educational policy in the United States, is a product of the civil rights movement. However, Title IX prohibiting gender discrimination in education doesn't make it into the Civil Rights Act. So remember, prohibiting gender discrimination in schools, it doesn't make it into the Civil Rights Act. Race makes it into the Civil Rights Act, right? So that you can't discriminate on the basis of race when it comes to education. But gender didn't make it into the Civil Rights Act. You could still discriminate on the basis of gender in educational facilities after the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And the reason is that really had to do with the priorities of interest groups, that these priorities were reflected in the policy. And so that interest groups were there was much more of a focus at this time period on ending racial segregation in schools. And they didn't want to people didn't want to jeopardize the Civil Rights Act and ending racial segregation in schools by adding sex into the component on education. Also, that even though prohibiting gender discrimination in employment was added, remember learning about how that was added as a way to sort of kill the Civil Rights Act. It didn't kill the Civil Rights Act. So feminists were saying, look, we'll focus on that. We'll take that. We want to end gender discrimination in employment first, and we're willing to sacrifice education. And so these priorities are reflected in policy. In Title VI of the Civil Rights Act prohibits racial discrimination in school, and Title VII prohibits racial discrimination in employment, but it also prohibits racial or gender discrimination in education. And so we'll just end here, just refreshing our memory about Title IX. We talked about this way early in the semester when we were talking about the public policy process. But it'll be a good segue into the next video that you're going to be watching. Keep in mind that this was passed after the Civil Rights Act. It's not a part of the Civil Rights Act. It was passed by Congress in 1972, and it was enacted in 1975. It's federal law that prohibits sex discrimination in any school receiving federal funding. It has the same language as Title VI that's in the Civil Rights Act, but instead of saying race, it replaces sex is it put in the place of race. And so it says no person in the United States shall on the basis of sex be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subject to discrimination under any educational program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. And keep in mind that these were added to education acts that were up to for renewal. And feminists and their allies saw this as an opportunity to add sex equity in education. Now, as you're going to learn in the next video, equity in sports, that was not in the forefront of the Title IX. It was about equity broadly in education as it relates to gender. But as we'll see in the next video, and as we'll see in the movie Keepers of the Game, that Title IX is now pretty much synonymous with gender equity in sports. Okay, thanks for listening, and I'll talk to you later.